My name is Jonathan Green. I work at the ABC and for a magazine called Meanjin, and this is a Yarra Conversation. That's what we're here for, to talk about that magnificent river just out there. We're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people this evening, and accordingly, I'd like to ask Uncle Bill Nicholson to formally welcome us to country.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start welcoming you to country in the language of this land. To me, the language of anybody's culture is the basis of the culture because it's how you express everything that's based on your culture. And for an attack on your language or to be taken from you is one of the worst things that can happen to your culture. And it's something that did happen to us. And as part of our revitalisation and our healing today, we're trying to bring back our language. So I'll give you a snapshot of it. Reminjika, Gamala Mangil, Barambun Yalambu, Warranjeri Balak, Nirana Maranbik, Bill Nicholson. Now, that won't make any sense to you because the Woiwurrung language was illegal to be spoken in 1863, and it's something, as I said, we're trying to bring back. To make sense, I'll translate it. And by the way, Woiwurrung is the language of the Wurundjeri people. So welcome, greetings, good day from the Wurundjeri people. My name is Uncle Bill Nicholson. Now, as part of custom, I suppose, in the modern era, as part of welcoming people to country, we acknowledge our elders past and present. I'd like to continue that. I'd also like to acknowledge our cultural leaders of today. Here in Victoria, it's not the easiest thing to keep culture alive, but there are some great warriors out there, and you'll meet one of them later. But I'd like to acknowledge one of them, Uncle Dave, who's here, who you're going to see later, and Auntie Alice is also here as elders of the Wurundjeri, and Carmen, who is a great help at the Wurundjeri Council. Now, I acknowledge my elders past for a couple of reasons. My culture, my identity, but I suppose most of all my survival. And I'm going to name three of them, because this sacred river that flows behind us here, which is now called Yarra, which we never called it Yarra, by the way, we called it Birrarung, the Misty River, or Mist on the River. Birrarung Mars, the traditional banks of the Misty River. These three men were the head men or representatives of the clans of this region. So Billaballeri, the father of Simon Wonga. If it wasn't for Simon Wonga, we would not even be here. So very important people. I'd also like to acknowledge, these are all brothers, by the way, Meanjin, the father of William Barak, and Barupton, also known as Jagga Jagga, the father of Keel Bandora, where Bandora gets its name. These were the three headmen at the time when John Batman came to this country, and they had the authority of the whole stretch and the catchment of the Birrarung. The Birrarung itself is a symbol of our physical and spiritual connection. Physically, it relates to the resources used under traditional law, sustainable use of the resources that we use from our sacred river. Spiritually, it relates to our stories relating to creation. Man comes from the clay of the river banks, women from the water itself. And there is many significant cultural sites, ceremonial sites, birthing sites, living sites, all along this sacred river. I was just mentioning earlier, so I will add this part. I believe if you don't have some sort of want to protect this river, you have to question whether you're actually alive. Because every living thing that lives on this landscape relies on this sacred river. And that is the importance of caring for it and keeping it healthy and strong. Because if the river isn't healthy and strong, the people that rely on it, you've got to question about their health and strength as well. Now, traditional life was very sustainable, tens of thousands of years, very structured under traditional law, very knowledgeable with the extended input of family members into young children, very efficient where you'd work a lot less than what you actually work today if you work full-time, and a very fit and healthy culture as well. Now, it wasn't a coincidence that the health of the river and the health of the people of the river both were affected by the impacts of colonisation. The only thing I really want to mention about that particular time period is colonisation is a lesson to be learnt here in this country. Now, if we call ourselves a mature, civilised society, there are many lessons to be learnt about how not to treat country and how not to treat people. And with such wise, intelligent people that live on our land today, the scientific input, the cultural input, and everything in between, I really believe as a joint effort and a strong community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that we can benefit this sacred river. Colonisation restricted our culture, our ability to care for this river. Policies were designed to actually eradicate it. So if you do meet any Wurundjeri people, shake their hand, because we're not actually supposed to be here. But we are here, and we have a very strong interest in it, what we call our birthright, protecting this river, looking after this river, and passing it on to our future generations, as it had happened for many thousands of generations previously. Now, the Welcome to Country is actually a law ceremony. The best way to describe it is Australian LAW law says that if you want to travel to another land or another country, you need a passport. Tandarram is your cultural passport. I know for a fact that it happened only metres down this river, the old crossing place that they blew up many years ago. But basically what it symbolised was access to resources and access to country to do your business. We would offer you vegetation to symbolise your resource access, the snapping of spears to symbolise your safety, the offering of water to symbolise our unity, that you can trust us, and the walking through the smoke of burning leaves, the symbolisation of what the old people call murup. See, murup is spirit, and in the traditional ways of thinking, once your physical body passes away, your spirit still resides on country. That's why Aboriginal people will say, my ancestors are there to help me. I get my strength from my ancestors, because we believe they're still here. So we believe in both good and bad spirit. So we get people to walk through the smoke to cleanse their spirit and cleanse the landscape that they're meeting on. Now, they won't let me light the fire up here, so you're going to have to imagine it. But I'd just like to say, to feel truly welcome to Wurundjeri country, this is the law. You must help care for it. You must look after one another. You must respect country. You must respect culture. And you must respect people. And if you do, Meanjin Yiman Wurundjeri Balak Willambiek, welcome to Wurundjeri country. Welcome to Wurundjeri home. Thank you.
Thanks, Uncle Bill. What an amazing opportunity for this country right here and now to hear words like that, to bring that into the modern environment, to act on that understanding, to try and build between our peoples. I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional custodians of the land. It's the Wurundjeri, part of the Kulin Nations, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. This evening we have Uncle Bill, and thank you for your warm welcome. Acknowledge Uncle Dave Wandon, who will be speaking to us later this evening. Auntie Alice Kalasa as well. Thank you, Auntie Alice. A quote for you, and this is from a different culture. I don't know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god. That's T.S. Eliot on the Mississippi, which is not quite the Yarra, 3,730 kilometres of the Mississippi is against 242 of the Yarra, but maybe we perhaps challenge them on brown. That's something we have in spades in that mighty river just outside. Our task this evening is to imagine that river, to imagine the Yarra, to engage in this Yarra conversation hosted by Melbourne Water. And it's a river that has hosted life in this place for 30,000 years for human life, other lives for longer. And that all changed substantially in 1835. It's a blink of an eye, that 182 years. But clearly the change has been incredibly substantial. Everything changed for that river. It's not a river, though, that was unaccustomed to change, and we'll hear a bit about that in a moment. But it made that jump from Indigenous cohabitant of this country, a respected entity, to resource, a thing to be used and to be exploited and despoiled. Now, we get to say what we feel tonight about a river that's having something of a renaissance. There are platypus up the river. It's a stream with protected leafy fringes. It's a place where we hear its stories of its extraordinary past. It's why we're here tonight. It's as part of a development of a Yarra strategic plan, and that's a process that's already moved from an advisory committee to discussion paper to action plan to legislation, and now to this, to a phase that welcomes all of us and our thoughts and our contributions and our ideas and engagement to build a sense of community, a community feeling, a vision around the river and the place that it holds in our lives, the impacts of our lives on that river. It's our strong brown God. the thing is to make it even stronger. So tonight the idea is for you to be stimulated by ideas, to be challenged, to be motivated in that idea of trying to get that understanding, that passion for the river and the place. Lots of questions, the opportunity for that later in the evening, and opportunities to online to lodge your thoughts and your stories. And we want you to walk away from tonight. The idea is to walk away thinking, with ideas, with feelings about this place and the river. A structure tonight, there'll be a forum. We're having 5 presentations on different aspects of the river as past and present. After that, we'll be having a panel, or at least after the forum, there'll be a cup of tea. Then we'll have a panel, and then a Q&A to follow that panel. So your opportunity to get up and ask a question, have your say. And the 5 presentations we're about to hear to get things going, they run the gamut of the subject matter, from the place of the Birrarung for the Wurundjeri to pollution and revitalisation. We're going to hear from Dr. Gary Presland, we're going to hear from Uncle Dave Wandon, we're going to hear from Dr. Vincent Pettygrove, Janet Belitho and Gavin O'Neill. Remaking of the Yarra River is Dr. Gary Presland's topic to begin, and he's going to join you right now.
Thank you, Jonathan. I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, members of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Some years ago, I did a major study of the natural history of Melbourne, a central part of which, of course, was looking at the river. And that resulted in a book which was profusely illustrated. Of all the illustrations in the book, the one that's about to come up, hopefully, is my favourite. Next slide. It is my favourite because, or do I have to do it? There you go. You didn't tell me that. Oh, I've got the pointer, of course. I can do anything. There's a turn on laughter as well. This is my favourite image of Melbourne. I have, however, I have 2 regrets about this image. I suppose I should say the reason that it is my favourite image is because I'm one of those nerdy people that you hear about who ooh and ah over maps for hours on end and think of maps in the same way that people think about books, because they are providers of immense amounts of information. This particular map is one such. I have, however, 2 regrets. Firstly, that I have only 7 minutes to talk about this, because I could bore you witless for the next 2 hours talking about this map. And secondly, that there is virtually nothing that you can see on this chart. I should refer to it as a chart because it is, in fact, was created by in a maritime context. There is virtually nothing in this chart that you will find now. All of the natural features that you can see marked on this chart are now gone, and that is something I think to be greatly regretted. So the bad news I'll give you at the beginning. The river that we refer to, that we are making strategic plans about now, is certainly in the length that you can see displayed here, entirely artificial in some respect. There is nothing natural about it anymore. However, because I'm an historian and so I live in the past, so the Yarra that I invite you to imagine is the Yarra of the 1830s, or even this map which was created in 1863. Even 30 years after colonisation, we can still see a wide range of natural features that are now completely gone, and that's really what I want to talk about at the moment. So can you see this light? Yes? The first thing, of course, is the river course has changed. Now it flows there. Because from 1880, a canal was dug, the Coode Canal, creating what was Coode Island, that area in there. All of these wetland, all of these areas of standing water, the only one that survives, of course, is the site of the Australian Formula One track around this thing here. This one here, the Barracks Lagoon, is gone. These ones, unnamed swamps, as Europeans would refer to them. Sandridge Lagoon, the biggest one of all, West Melbourne Swamp, 30 hectares, gone. But there are also features that are not here that we see now, things like the extension of Moonee Ponds Creek coming in through here, dug in 1890 to transport coal from, allow ships to come up to wharves that were put in here so that coal could be unloaded directly into the goods shed for the Victorian Railways, because of course their trains they were steam trains and they ran on coal. That's a major change to the landscape. And further away from from the estuary down here, Elwood Swamp, or sometimes St Kilda Swamp, drained in the latter two decades of the 19th century. So we're talking major changes in landscape. The vegetation all through this area was, of course, eventually all stripped away. And now it's largely, although 30 years had gone by since Europeans had settled in the area, it was still pretty open. These major features occupied in European thinking an ambivalent place, because it was a pastoralist society essentially, but the swamps could not be ploughed and they couldn't be fished in to any great extent, so they occupied a place that was neither water nor land, and thus they were avoided. Moreover, they were thought of as being the source of disease, hence our word malaria, because disease was caused by air coming from swamps. So these features sit in a very interesting way within the culture of European colonists, and also sit in direct contrast to the way in which the indigenous people, the members of the Kulin Nation, used this area, because the presence of all of these what were referred to as swamps were the key to major meetings of Kulin people, where clans came from down here in the Wathaurong, off this map, from the Bellarine Peninsula, from the Taungurung clans in the Goulburn and Ovens rivers, Boonwurrung clans coming up from the south, from as far away as Wilson's Promontory, and these were major meetings of the Kulin world, essential for the year-to-year maintenance of that particular nation. Now, unfortunately, all gone, and I'm also gone. My time is up. Thank you.
I don't get an introduction, but apparently my name precedes me. My name is Uncle Dave London, and I'm an elder of the Wurundjeri Tribe Land Council. And I'm currently the only elder who has been charged with managing the land that was traditional Wurundjeri country. And it's been a privilege to do so. It's also been a difficult job because of capacity within Wurundjeri people to remember how to care for country. But I've been doing a lot of presentations that I've been going into my land management, and I did one just earlier this week, last week, I can't remember, there's so many presentations going on. But they asked my thoughts on the Yarra. Now, I can tell you my life story of growing up in Hillsville for the first 6 years and then moving down to Reservoir, coming down into the city here to where the golf course is, Yarra Bend, being taught to catch my first eel, and fishing all the way along the Yarra River, all the way up to Hillsville, and later on even further out towards Warburton Way. As a child, looking at the Yarra as it was then, and not knowing any different, that it was a beautiful place to camp, to fish, to sit around the campfire and tell stories. Now, my uncles had taught me these tips and tricks of catching fish were also telling me stories about our culture. But as a young child, I didn't listen, and I actually forgot most of what I've been taught. But as I went into land management and started listening to my elders, this didn't happen until I was in my 40s. We're stubborn people, us Aboriginal people, when we don't want to be told something, is I realised there was much more of a history to the Yarra River. And what I discovered was what used to be plentiful when I was a child, which was catching the eels. And the eels were an important source of food and protein at the right time of the year for the Aboriginal people, not just Wurundjeri. There were reasons for huge gatherings. And in the 1800s, maybe in the early 1900s, was the last recorded Tandera corroboree of a meeting of the Kulin Nations. And the estimates vary of between 300 to 500 Aboriginal people gathering on the banks of the river at the Bowl and Billabong and celebrating the eel harvest. Think about that, 300 people minimum camping on the river, and they were there for a few weeks celebrating the harvest of the eels. Can anyone imagine now going anywhere on the Yarra and collecting enough eels, plus the other resources that were available to us, as mentioned by Gary, to be able to support 300 to 500 people for 3 weeks? It can't happen. The largest amount of eels that I know that were discovered in one place, which was at Warrandyte, research actually, Warrandyte on the other side of the river, that there were 80 eels found in one go. I remember as a kid going out and fishing and gathering with myself, my brother and my uncle, 30 eels in one night, and that was considered to be a good catch. Now, if you consider 1 eel per person over 3 weeks multiplied by 300 and still be sustainable, that's my vision for the Yarra. Not in 10 years, and probably not even in 100 years, to be able, for anybody to be able to go to the Yarra and actually harvest the resources. So when we talk about improving the Yarra, protecting the Yarra, don't think about it for the next 5, 10 years, because there's the funding for that, or there's funding for 50 years. Think of it for 1,000 years, because we made it, we kept it sustainable for many thousands of years. What's that green light I'm supposed to be looking at? It tells me, because I've got a little story about the creation of the Yarra. Now, Bill talked about the spirit of the river. Well, our people, in one of our creation stories, actually witnessed the birth of the Yarra River. That's how long we've been here. The Yarra River's not all that old in the big scheme of the world, and in particular of Victoria. It's not as old as the Maribyrnong. It's not as old as the Werribee. And we actually have creation stories about being here and watching that river form before our very eyes. And that river was formed because of a request to our creator spirit, Bunjil, and he granted us that wish. And the story goes on a lot longer than that. And I'm not sure, with all my other elders, whether I'm actually allowed to share it. But needless to say, the creation story is there, and it is a beautiful story. But what I like about it is that a researcher got a hold of this story, and he said, there's always a little bit of truth in fiction. Most people do think of our creation stories as made-up stories. And he did some research into the geology and found out that at one stage, up around the Healesville area, there was this massive lake. And that was our traditional hunting grounds up there for the Yarra people. for the Wurundjeri people. And we asked for some of that water to be taken away to improve our grassland so we could hunt more marsupials rather than ducks and fish. And it was granted. And Bunjil came down and carved the river for us with a huge stone axe, which was our way of describing the noises that we heard as the Yarra was forming and what was actually happening. And it has now been proved by science that that did actually happen. It was a seismic event, an earthquake event, if you like, that actually opened up the Yarra and drained Lake Marul and caused, at the same time, helped with the filling of what we now know as Port Phillip Bay, which made us get in a bit of trouble with the Bunurong people because we drained our lake into half of their land. And that's a continuing battle to this day. But the great thing is they went and did some research and they found that, yes, where the creation story comes from, around Hillsville, Yarra Glen, which is now known as the Yarra Flats and does flood still, that it is actually a huge deposit of lake sediment. So not only do we have knowledge in our creation stories, we now have modern science that actually helps us back up these stories. But remember, we looked after it for... So from what I gather, it's 15 to 20,000 years ago that we witnessed the birth of the Yarra River. And I would like people in this room to commit to another 20,000 years of looking after it, because I reckon it's going to take that long to get it back to what it originally was. Small steps, but we'll get there. My motto is, for our land management team, when they ask what we can do, what can you do? I said, we can do the impossible. Miracles take just a little bit longer. So together we can heal the Yarra and heal the people. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Vincent Pettigrove. I'm from the University of Melbourne. I'm probably the nerdiest of the speakers tonight because I'm going to show you graphs, but there's no exam afterwards. Some of the graphs I'm going to show is from a report we just recently did last year on the Yarra River. So we've already been speaking about, the European settlement here has only been happening since 1835, and in that time we've seen massive changes in the condition of the Yarra River. You really can't read that graph very well, but we go from being blue to a clear river with Indigenous people living here for 20,000 years or 30,000 years, to one when there's this massive change with colonisation. So we have sewage and industrial waste coming out into the river, and we've had this battle about trying to sewer the whole catchment and try to get a lot of that waste out of the river. We're now into what's the green stage, which is where we're seeing, in fact, if you look on the x-axis there, that one on the left, you'll see that that's the population that's been growing over that time. We're seeing new challenges in what's happening in the Yarra River and the type of pollution that we're getting. And it's going to be more stressful as we have large populations living in our catchment. Told you I'd give you some graphs. So we talk about the Yarra being turbid, muddy, and it's much maligned for that reason. In fact, it's actually one of the reasons why it's so ecologically healthy. So it's actually got a benefit. The actual mud, as we'll see in a minute, actually can absorb a lot of the pollutants that would cause stress to the animals. So if we look here at, if we compare Melbourne, you can see that Melbourne's that little green one down the bottom there, if you can't see it. But it ranks actually quite good by global standards. If we look at other cities around the world, it's still having quite low levels of faecal contamination. And in places like the Yarra, you can definitely go swimming there during the summer when there's no storm flows. And we can, obviously, there's some people in the room here that go boating down in the estuaries as well. And that's a marvellous thing we can do in a city that's so big. And we need to keep those sorts of values. But one of the bad things about our cities, we do have a lot of pollution that we do still need to manage. And this is an example of zinc. And all those green ones are now up at the upper end. They're various creeks. They're the Yarra and other creeks around Melbourne. And we see that Melbourne and Australian cities generally have very high levels of some of these heavy metals like zinc. The good news is, a place like the Yarra, all that mud actually absorbs all the zinc and removes a lot of that toxicity. So it's actually quite a good thing.
But we need to manage it. And where does all this come from? Well, it comes from cars, roads, infrastructure, industrial pollutants, a whole lot of different things. So a lot of our research, we're still trying to address, how do we reduce these types of pollution and what are the pollutants we need to look at? And so the obvious ones we think about is mud. But if we didn't have the mud, we'd probably see the Yarra going green in summer as the light would penetrate into the water and we'd see a lot more plant growth. So I think, we need to reassess how we think about our muddy river. It's actually quite healthy as a result. But with our research, there's a whole lot of other things that we're looking at the moment, and probably the most serious one is synthetic pyrethroids. We're seeing this all over Melbourne at the moment, and even in the last 5 years, 20% of the areas we looked at had that pollutant, now about 80%. So it is something that we need to address, and this is where we need to work together to try and reduce some of these pollutants. Some of these other ones you've probably heard about, petroleum hydrocarbons and coming from cars, perfluorinated compounds coming from flame retardants, that sort of thing. Microplastics, which are things that we can use in cosmetics. So a lot of decisions we personally make can have an effect on our environment and on the Yarra. So there's a whole lot of different things, and I'll leave it at that. That's, I think, where do we need to go? Well, a lot of the work that's being done is catchment-based management. We still need to realise that every creek that flows into the Yarra has an impact on the Yarra and that catchment, what happens in the catchment. We still need to look at dry weather spills as well, because there's still quite a lot of evidence of point source pollution in our catchments from industrial areas and all that. So it's not, we need to be doing good research to try and work out what are the pollutants causing the problems, where are they coming from, how we can manage it. And we do really need to keep monitoring our rivers and making sure we can see what pollutants are there. So we don't want to find out after all the fish have died that we had a problem. We need to be acting quite early. So thank you.
Good evening. I'm just going to take these off. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge that we meet on your land and pay my respects to elders past and present. My subject is the entrance to the Yarra River, and I'd like to introduce you to the place on the river that I know the best. It's under the Westgate Bridge, and I call it Westgate Beach. It's as close as we can get to the river entrance on the southern side. The Yarra River Protection Bill, currently going through a legislative process, undertakes to protect the Yarra, the Birrarung, as one living and integrated natural entity. But the extension of Webb Dock into the bay for port activity means you can't go any further down the river than here, so the mouth of the river remains tantalising and elusive. But it's such a potent place. Is there any more potent place to the imagination than where the river and the sea meet? Or in Melbourne's case, where the river meets the bay. It's a mixing place of salt and fresh water, of entry and exit. But as Gary has said, there is no place on the river as profoundly altered as the river entrance. It's no longer the narrow stream with the narrow entrance, as Gary has spoken about, when the river and the wetlands on either side bled into one another, so it was hard to tell where the river ended and the wetlands began. But now the river's edges are neatly lined with bluestone rocks that come from the other side of the river, and the river mouth is wide and open. It's the same river, but no longer the same river. The river has been canalised, smoothed and sculpted, largely to serve the needs of the port. Ships get bigger, they require a deeper draft, and with each change of shipping technology comes a change to the river and to the port. The Yarra is the conduit, the sea highway, the sea road for nearly everything we consume. Our morning coffee, the bikes we ride, the cars we drive, they all enter the river at this point, in a box or in a ship, a car carrier. The rain falls somewhere in the Yarra catchment. It follows curb and channel to the drain, to the creek, to the river. The Yarra River is the conduit, the sea highway, the sea road on the return journey for every bit of litter that's dropped in the streets of the catchment. Go down to Westgate Beach 24 hours after a downpour, and on that beach, a reverse supermarket of the detritus of our consumption. Straws, cigarette lighters, cans and bottles, and the little soy sauce fish that seem to breed among the rocks. But most of all, there's polystyrene, aged chunks that look like coral, and then between the rocks, dense with the constituent beads into which it crumbles. The nexus between rain and riverborne pollution is revealed as obviously as night follows day, and it's a nexus that we need to break. But that is not all to the life on this little beach. Mark Norman, Chief Conservation Scientist at Parks Victoria, has dived deep into the river at this place. The river lives. The oyster blenny breeds under the Westgate Punt platform. Look under a rock and you'll find life there. Swans as well as ships go under the bridge. It's rich in polychaetes, segmented worms. And the Friends of Westgate Park care for this bank of the river, which has only recently been added to the park. Between the rocks, they've planted grasses, saltbush, rounded noonflower, and pigface. And soon the pigface will flower with magenta fire, as Georgiana McRae described it. Banksia integrifolia, the banksia of this place, now line the river, and the fragrant acacias, shaking their blossom curls, as Gary Owen once described them, bloom once again in Westgate Park. Overhead, the river of traffic flows unceasingly across the Westgate Bridge. It snags, breakdowns and crashes. But the bridge offers mobility and access, but the river offers us the stuff of life, water. Every plastic bottle of water washed down the Yarra River and landing on this beach is an affront and an insult to our Yarra, as our drinking water straight from the tap is some of the highest quality drinking water in the world. 70% of Melbourne's drinking water comes from the Yarra River. As Melburnians, we all have Yarra flowing through us. We've got a serious dose of complacency around the Yarra River. We laugh at the stories of times past when the river was befouled with noxious industries and trades, but we're blind to the contemporary sources of pollution. The Yarra River Strategic Plan is to be grounded in the community's vision. And as Uncle Bill said at the start, the river's health and our health cannot be separated. And as the poet Les Murray said, nothing is said till it's dreamed out in words. And we are now being invited to contribute our words and our thoughts to this vision, which in the plan is for 50 years, but Uncle Dave has encouraged us to think beyond, to imagine the Yarra. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the people of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And Uncle Bill, thank you for that wonderful welcome to country, and Dave for your amazing words, and Alice, it's great to have you here again, so thank you. The Yarra looms really large in my family. My sister actually rescued my brother from drowning in it when we were kids, and this picture in the middle of those 4 kids, I actually come from a family of 6, but the 4 daggy-looking kids up there, I'm one of those, and the really poorly dressed one in the mustard pants and red shirt, who probably deserved to be drowned in that outfit, is the one that fell in. And it happened on one of our regular Sunday drives to the Yarra Valley. And in this particular case, it was to the Yarra Glen Hotel, which you can also see there. And there was always a pub and a TAB involved in all of these drives to the Yarra Valley. But so after a counter meal, we got bored and headed off to the river, and where somehow my brother ended up falling in the river, and it was flowing pretty hard that day. And my very quick thinking sister, and we actually thought he was gone. He was really getting washed away. And my quick thinking sister, the smartest one out of the 5 boys, 1 girl, she was the smart one. And she bolted off, ran down the river, grabbed hold of an acacia sapling which was growing sort of right close to the water, and stuck out her leg, submerged herself, and my brother grabbed it as he swept past, and miraculously saved him. So it's fair to say that the parental supervision really upped after that particular drive. But it was certainly a very momentous day. But as a teenager, I grew up in Ringwood, and my friends and I would take the bus from Ringwood out to Warrandyte, and on those stinking hot summer days, it was always a great place to go and meet friends and hang out. And sort of 30 years later, after those sort of teenage years, I still take my kids down to the Yarra River, and where we go for rides and walks, and occasionally even go for a paddle on the river. And for us, it's just this amazing place of refuge and actually wilderness in some parts. And it still amazes us that you have something like that so close to the city. And increasingly, we're becoming more and more fascinated by that cultural story. Just the fact that you are walking on a land where others have trod and lived and camped for thousands of years. It's a very, very powerful space for us. I think that living and playing near the Yarra River is a really big part of why I got interested in environmental science and waterway restoration work. And it's fantastic now to be working at a place like Melbourne Water, which does play such a big part of protecting and restoring the Yarra. And you may not know it, but under the Water Act, Melbourne Water is actually the designated caretaker of river health. And what that means is we effectively look after most of the waterways in the Port Phillip and Western Port catchment, and a fair, the majority of the 242 k's of the Yarra River. And we're really fortunate that we have actually a pretty reliable and adequate source of funding to do some pretty exciting work, and that's the waterways and drainage charge that you see on your bill. In terms of the kind of work that we do, these figures actually relate to work we do across the whole Port Phillip and Western Port area, but gives you a sense of the kind of work we do and the sort of the volume. But in a typical year, we do about 70 kilometres of revegetation work, control weeds over about 850 kilometres, do a few hectares of aquatic habitat improvements, I think in wetlands, billabongs, and in the tributaries. Disturbingly, take out nearly 500 cubic metres of litter from the river, and put in kilometres of stock exclusion fencing. Also do quite a bit of erosion control. We used to do an enormous amount of erosion control. It was mostly what we do, but we've certainly evolved over the time to do less of that, realising in many cases it's a natural process, but quite a bit of erosion control still. And also stormwater quality projects. So these, through our Living Rivers program, and working really collaboratively with council to do that, because, as I said earlier, we're responsible for the river and its banks, but we have to work really closely with local government to manage things like stormwater, for example, and we just can't do the work alone. But we also work with farmers and land managers to take a broader catchment approach. We also get involved in urban planning to avoid inappropriate development along the river, and also run education programs with schools and community groups to increase awareness of issues around waterway health, and also encourage greater care and stewardship for the river. And for me, it's incredibly exciting to be involved in an organisation that does this kind of work, and this is a bit of an example of the kind of work we do. This image at the top, it's exactly the same waterway. It's actually the Stringybark Creek in Coldstream, so one of the tributaries of the Yarra, and it's standing on a road. You're looking upstream, and that's what the waterway looks like. When you look downstream, that's the result of work done in collaboration with landholders through our stream frontage grant program. And in the space of that photo was taken, a few short years after the work was done. But you can just see the difference and what a dramatic impact it makes. And in this case, things like the erosion's under control, which improves the water quality. The native vegetation, you can see, it's just thriving, so creating habitat for animals and fish. And also there's, you can't see it there, but there's also fencing there to keep stock out, to again stop the water getting muddy, and also the vegetation being trampled. So that particular work, that's got a strong environmental focus, but increasingly we have a focus on amenity and recreation as well, and there's a few examples of that below, because we're really listening to the community, who also not just want to see the environment restored, they're wanting to see destinations created, they're wanting to see placemaking, and a big part of that is getting access and having things like bike paths. But so despite all of this exciting work that we do as an organisation, and again the vast majority of that does happen in collaboration, and despite how relatively well resourced we are and what a good position we're in to do good things, we are under no illusion that we can do this alone as an organisation, and we understand more than ever that it is all about collaboration. And that's why the Yarra Strategic Plan and the vision is just such an exciting process, because and we were very fortunate to be actually appointed as the lead agency to deliver that the strategic plan and the vision, and something which we think is a real privilege. But it's so important because it's a process that actually does bring all of the different players together, and we're getting a real sense of that tonight. Whether it be the traditional owners, the river keeper, the local communities, councils, farmers, academics, business developers, all of the different government agencies that are involved. It does bring us all together, and it is that kind of collaboration which is utterly critical to making sure that we really can set the river up on a trajectory of restoration and health. So we're very, very proud to be a part of it. We really look forward to working with you all on developing that vision and that plan. And on that note, you will all have on your seat a card. It's a blank postcard. So we'd all invite you to actually, as we go to the break, just think about what's your story. What do we need to know about your particular perception and experience of the river? So please, we'd really invite you to jot something down at the break. But if you can't do that, then we also have a website, the Imagine the Yarra website, where you can actually place your story into the mix as well. We're then going to gather up all of those stories, and that is all going to feed into the creation of the vision and the creation of the Yarra Strategic Plan. So thank you very much.
There's a fantastic sense in all of that, of the possibilities of this conversation. I think you'd have to agree. Grab your cards, grab a pencil, head for a cup of tea. We're going to have a panel discussion after the break, and a chance for you too to have your say after that. It's now, he said, looking at his clock, 3 minutes to 7 o'clock. Could we be back 10 past? Would that be, give that a crack? And we'll be that we can. The impossible is within our grasp. So 10 past, we'll be starting off again. Mine too, they'll be picked up later, we promise, but they'll be collected at the door on the way out. Now, we were heading towards an 8 o'clock finish. But we're going to try and get plenty of time for questions as well before we get there. Your chance to have your say, but we're going to have a bit of a chat up here first. Let me introduce everybody. Way over there, hello Chris. Jonathan. Chris Chesterfield. Now, he is chair of the Yarra River Protection Ministerial Authority Committee.
Was.
He is. Sorry. Chair of the Yarra River Protection Ministerial Advisory Committee. There is no authority. A research leader, water sensitive cities based at Monash University. Now, Maya Ward is next to Chris. Now, she's a writer and a river pilgrim. Now, her book, The Comfort of Water, A River Pilgrimage, we will talk about in a moment. Jeefa Greenaway is next to me. Now, he is a director of Greenaway Architects and Director of Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, a lecturer at the University of Melbourne. Let's start with you, Maya, because you did this amazing thing in 2003, which was to walk the full course of the Yarra River, top to tail. What's it like at the very tip? Describe that spot for us.
That's actually a more complex question than you might think. The very source of the Yarra is completely off limits to most people because it's in the Upper Yarra catchment area, which only a very few people are allowed in. We were granted permission to go in there, not during our pilgrimage, but later, and saw the very small Yarra where it enters into the Upper Yarra Dam like another great marul, a great dam. But we did walk through the areas just in amongst the other catchment areas, and it's the high country. It's alpine, and so it's snow gums, and it is creeks this wide, crystal clear, tinkling and singing, beautiful stones.
And of course it transforms through its course. I mean, the feeling that you got from that journey, I mean, how what did you learn about the river? How did that change your thinking about it?
It's hard to convey in a short amount of time, but it was the most significant experience of my entire life. I had travelled and walked around in all sorts of different places in the world, tramping through the Himalayas. This was completely different. This was so powerful for so many reasons. We had our launch down in Williamstown, there where the river meets the sea on all sides, and Tamikapoki, Wurundjeri woman, came to our launch, as did Chris Chesterfield, and she asked that the spirits of the ancestors walk with us, and that was the most astonishing and generous gift imaginable. To walk all day, every day, for 22 days, following the river, to camp by the river every night, to experience those changes, to go through the city and, through, past piles of rubbish upended into the river, past stinking carcasses of sheep, to pristine forest, to the tallest forest in the entire world. The tallest tree on the planet is from that part of the world. It was cut down, but the tallest trees
was there once
ever grown. To walk all the way through and meeting people all the way, camping and staying on people's properties, asking complete strangers, can we camp on your land? When we told them what they were doing, them saying in a quiet voice, I've always wanted to do that. The sense of magic by calling ourselves pilgrims and really devoting ourselves to the course of the Yarra, to go where the river flows and to learn from the river as our main teacher. It took 7 years to write the book about walking the river, and I've been continuing, and I didn't understand what had happened after that time. I'm 4.5 years into a PhD to try and understand the depth of that experience.
Time to reflect.
Being in the land like that. So my sense is that, Aboriginal connection to land is the greatest gift of this country, and for us to learn about what that means, there's nothing more important.
Chris, let's talk for a moment about European disconnection and the effect that has had on the river. And it faces tremendous challenges, not least of which from the tremendous growth of this thing that we're sitting in now, of Melbourne and the suburbs that surround it.
You get a sense, though, that might be changing, I think. So, as you remarked, I guess, in your opening, we've, Europeans who colonise. Somebody say that for me? Colonised.
Too many vowels.
Too many vowels. And it's such a serious word too. Colonised and dispossessed. The Indigenous people had no sense of that connection. They were motivated by exploitation and how they could generate wealth for themselves. So it was a very selfish invasion, I think. And we've sort of carried that mindset forward, this sort of desperation to establish ourselves in this environment has, wreaked a heavy price, I guess, in terms of environment. But you get the sense that that's changing. We're rediscovering that connection. We're seeking that connection, and I think that's why talking about the Yarra is so timely, because we don't have the stories. We struggle, I think, to find the basis of that connection. So Maya doing a walk down the river is a way of, I guess, showing how we can create that connection to build new stories. I think around the river that we can share. But if you were a visitor to Melbourne and you wanted to understand something about this place by exploring the Yarra, you'd actually find it pretty difficult to find much meaning there. We haven't sort of translated our relationship with the river into things that have meaning and people can connect to.
I mean, Jeefa, this is your work in a bit of a nutshell, I think, is making that bridge between Indigenous knowledge and modern practice of trying to insinuate one into the other, inform that process. So in this task around the river, I mean, what's the pathway there? How do we make those connections?
I'm quite interested in how we can start to elicit a connection to history and meaning in a place. And through that, often it's a case of trying to connect a country in meaningful ways. And so, as an example, I worked on the Quarry Heritage Trust at Federation Square, which abuts Birrong. And what was intriguing about that proposition in terms of the design challenge was the building actually turns its back on the river. So consequently, it actually precludes you to see that vantage point and be able to see that connection to the lifeblood of the city. And so the strategy that we employed there was to embed a river narrative through the building. And so consequently, what it enabled us to do was start to tell this story, and then also to reveal that Indigenous knowledge systems have tangible meaning. And as we can see through this discussion tonight, it's being validated through Western science. And so consequently what it does, it enables us to recast and reframe our connection to this country. And so what we can then do is start to delve down into the deep history that resides in this place. And so consequently, I'm inspired by the places in which we're located, and they become the genesis for design ideas and become inspiration for design strategies. And as an Aboriginal man, it seems to me the way we can start to demonstrate a cultural continuity is to start to reference our connection to this place.
And integrate that into modern systems and modern structures.
Very much so.
So I get the feeling, Chris, that we need to get this right now, because the pressures that are about to come in this urban area are going to be beyond what we can currently imagine. And if we don't set this framework, then much is in jeopardy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, well, it's clear Melbourne's experiencing what could be described, I think, as its third great wave of population growth. There was that massive influx of people driven by the gold rushes from the 1850s. So Melbourne just, grew enormously, and it became known as Smellbourne. But people of vision created a city, I guess, built on the wealth of gold, which transformed Melbourne into, marvellous Melbourne. We created great parklands in the inner ring of the city. I think that second great wave of population growth was post-war, and that's added so much vitality and diversity to the city. But again, we sort of responded with some visionary planning and some investment in the future, with starting to create open space networks along our waterways, and the Yarra was a great beneficiary of that. So we have this incredible legacy in the urban parts of Melbourne. I think there's 2,500 hectares of public land along the Yarra through its urban reaches. The Yarra River Protection Bill that's going through Parliament at the moment proposes that should be incorporated into a great Yarra urban parklands network, so we start to think about it as an integrated living entity, if you like. But I think all of that's under threat unless we respond to this third new wave of population growth, which is possibly going to take Melbourne to 8+ million people by 2050. And I was watching something on TV last night. I think it was Travel Man, that quirky ABC program.
Gasped at the thought of 8+ million people.
Yeah. Well, they were talking about New York. I mean, and they described New York as a city of 8 million people. So here we are on the verge of becoming what New York is today in terms of population. And if we don't have the vision, and we don't back up that vision with the investment in that future, then we risk losing a great deal, I think.
And there's much to protect, Mo. You talk about the absolute source of the river being, well guarded, but the forest that surround it, the forests that line its tributaries, the forests of its broader catchment are continually under threat. So our thinking about what we're trying to safeguard, it needs to be fairly broad.
Absolutely. It's quite shocking to understand that the clear fell logging that's happening in the tributaries of the Yarra and all around the Central Highlands for a paltry economic gain, when the price of the water that would be generated if they left the forest in the ground, when they cut down the forest, the new forest has to grow, and that takes up a lot of the water. That water then doesn't come into the tributaries, and the river health suffers. It doesn't come into dams. We don't have that water available for drinking. And that's worth $300 million, that water. And then the tourism is $300 million. Agriculture, it's also threatened by logging right now. So I live up in Warburton, right on the Yarra, and see the consequences, and it's devastating. The animals dying in their hundreds of thousands. It's absolutely devastating.
As we get lower, those challenges continue. I mean, and the pressure to use. We see land all along the lower reaches of the Yarra being eagerly sought after now. We see developments, and there needs to be a sensibility built into that sort of planning process.
And building in the policy framework to protect the Yarra is obviously an important ingredient within that. And so consequently, I think as people who operate within the built environment professions, we also have a responsibility to protect this country. And so the way we do that is to understand the connections, the sensitivities, and the importance of what the river actually is. And what we can also do is we can reveal some of that history, which facilitates that understanding of why it in fact has depth of meaning. And I think about, for instance, the natural crossing point that used to bridge across the river, which became the point of interaction between people as well, where the Boonwurrung crossed the river and engaged with the Wurundjeri. And that was dynamited out in the 1890s. There's still remnants of it that we can see to this day adjacent to Enterprise Park. But when we start to unpack what that actually means, we can start to understand some of the significance, because this was the confluence of the saltwater with the freshwater. And that starts to tell another story and starts to reference a connection to this place. And then we can start to celebrate this depth of meaning and share in a connection to the oldest continuing culture in the world. And so this becomes a mechanism to understand how we can start to recast our way we see the river, and then consequently we feel more compelled to protect it.
I mean, this is perhaps the most sobering thing we've seen this evening is the rapidity of the change and how much man-made change has come to the river in such a short space of time. But again, there's opportunity in that now.
It's also, I think, heartening to see the community reaction to some elements of that change, the pushback. There are many developments, I guess, that are happening on the Yarra that are contested. I think the disappointing thing is that because we haven't had a planning policy that embeds a vision for the river, that we've had to revisit these contests over development again and again, and some we succeed, I guess, in getting a reasonable outcome, and sometimes we don't, and that might depend on who's the government and who's the planning minister.
You've been watching it for a long time. I mean, you've been watching this for a couple of decades now. I mean, your sense of where we are now in terms of that ebb and flow?
Well, I think we've really dropped the ball in the 1990s. There are a couple of institutions around, I guess, that did planning. They produced things called concept plans, and concept plans were about, considering landscape views from the river out and views into the river, the intrusion of development onto the river. And we I guess that sort of ascendancy of that economic rationalism and let market forces seem to result in a bit of a relaxation of those controls, which I think we're now starting to assert again. And I guess the important thing is now too that we're having a conversation about the vision. So that if we're going to put planning policies in place,
yes,
those policies can embed that vision. So we've all got an understanding about what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and that should be, we should be able to ensure that that's consistent over a long period of time, so we don't have to keep fighting these battles over and over
tremendous,
again.
Community responsibility in the forming of that. Before your questions in a sec, but I may have thought from you, and I just wonder how the feeling of the river changes as it hits the city. Whether it's, as an observer, there must be a sense of it, but it's such a different environment. It's such a transformed environment. It's an environment not of the river's making as it hits this part of the world. How does that feel for the river pilgrim?
There are actually so many different sorts of environments along the river, and it's not as linear as you might think. I saw some really rare birds down in the docks, and then, for instance, going through the area like Warrandyte, which has been protected because it was a gorge. It was too steep to clear, and so the water quality there is very high. The vegetation, there's so many animals, it's stunning. And then you get into the Yarra Valley. This was 14 years ago that we walked. Then there were huge stretches where there was no vegetation on the river at all, and that we saw cows standing in the middle of the river shitting. So there's been a lot of great work done to redress that, but there's still a lot of problems way up. And so the river is a dynamic living entity and responds very quickly to our behaviour. Like when we make changes, the river responds. The river is alive. and will really work with us. And it's a very dynamic system. And so we met community groups all the way along who were planting and were watching the changes, were watching animals come back, watching rare plants come back. It's a fascinating and inspiring thing to be part of. That, you know, even down here, the work that Janet's doing, you know, bringing back that environment. But yes, it's very shocking to walk through. You know, it's sort of like the planning decisions to allow freeways along rivers.
Yes.
That's shocking. And so those kinds of planning decisions that totally destroy, you know, tens of kilometres along the river.
Well, I mean, the reassuring thing, Chief, is, I mean, that stretch of the Monash Freeway along there, I mean, it would be inconceivable, you would think and hope now, for a decision like that to be made, which is the sign of some sort of planning progress.
Yeah, you'd hope so. But a lot of people aren't familiar with some of the policy settings that are already in place. So, for instance, you know, you're obligated to do a cultural heritage management plan if you're within 200 metres of a named waterway. Most practitioners don't even realise some of these things. And so they become the triggers to start to unpack some of this complexity and actually are in place as it stands now. But really it's a case of taking that as an opportunity and then exploring new ways of doing things. But you know, you would hope in this day and age those sort of you know, decisions don't get made again, because we learn from those decisions and hopefully we can improve it. And there is always that capacity to remediate something which has already been done, which was a poor decision. And so we can actually claim that back in the same sort of regenerative
Perhaps
way.
not with the freeway, but...
That's right, but there are always mechanisms and ways
One
where
day.
we can explore. Exactly, yeah. And then we should.
Keep riding your bikes, people. There are microphones out there for your questions and relaxing the normal rules of engagement here, given the nature of the evening. Your observations on the things that we've been discussing tonight are welcome too. Microphones on each side. Very quick hand here in the front.
I guess I'm interested in what Maya was saying about major highways being constructed right next to rivers, which are cultural places, and also the North-East link at the moment, and the four options, option A, B, C and D, all of them transect the Yarra. Option A, which appears to be the most, I guess, economical in terms of dollar value signed, cuts right through the heart of the Bolan Billabong, which is where Uncle Dave was referring to, where 300 to 500 people could meet and festival and harvest for many, many weeks at a time. And so how does this community of people here feel about the fact that right now the government is planning that kind of intrusive activity on this beautiful living Yarra?
I wondered, Uncle Dave, do you have a thought on that? Would you like to?
Well, I didn't know about that development that they were just talking about, but you know, Wurundjeri Tribe Land Council is currently in negotiations with Melbourne Water and Parks Victoria about restoring the Bolan Billabong and returning it to the Wurundjeri people, where we can actually hold ceremony there again. And our long-term goal is to take a bark canoe and float it on the Billabong and show how we speared the eels and also how we trapped them making nets. And yeah, this is quite disturbing news, that kind of infrastructure is going to be placed so near to a place that is culturally and even historically, in a modern context, important to the river and the people and the Wurundjeri people. So I don't hear everything that's going on. I do like to keep my hands in the dirt, and I don't hear the political decisions that are getting made, but it is a concern, and obviously one I'll have to chase up with our other departments to find out what we're doing to... we don't ever want to stop development. We know that we can't. We understand that Australia and Melbourne has to grow, but definitely look for the solutions that gives everybody the best outcome.
A voice heard.
Yeah, but make sure that goes well into the future, not just because of a short-term economic benefit, or it's expedient to do so.
Chris, that's I mean, a disturbing thing, I mean, given what we were saying laughingly about the Monash and never...
We don't want to create another Monash Freeway, clearly. Well, I mean, I don't have any formal role, I guess, in any of these projects or responding to any of these projects at the moment, but I think they're still in the early stage of planning. The North East Link has been the great fear for the Yarra for a very long time. You know, it's always been expected that that project's going to happen at some stage. It's probably good that it didn't happen 20 or 30 years ago, because I think if it's got to happen, then there's a much greater chance that it will happen now in a way that doesn't
better environment for the
yeah,
process.
better environment for that. One of the elements of the new legislation is that all projects should have a net benefit for the river. Now I think there's a clause in the draft that possibly provides some exclusion for major transport projects. I'm not quite sure how that might work. But I think there'd be a massive fight. The government would have a massive fight on its hands if it was going to tear up Bollum with a freeway. So I think, you know, I'd be hoping that tunnelling is going to be the answer to protecting and preserving the Yarra environment from any impacts from that project. But others in the room might know a lot more than I do about that.
One there, and then you after that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Clem Newton-Brown. I'm a planning consultant and have been involved with activating the river for probably decades, I suppose, starting with the first water taxi on the river back in '92 and moving on to barbie boats and floating marquees and a cafe under the footbridge. As far as this plan goes, one thing which I think appears to be missing, and I'm not by no means suggesting that what's there is not important, but the activation of the river is something which has happened over hundreds of years. I mean, going back to when we had the ferry that used to go up to the tea gardens in Hawthorne, which is now Leondra, the Studley Park Boathouse, Fairfield Boathouse. We've had helicopters that have been landing on the river for 50 years. We've got boat regattas that used to draw tens of thousands of people. We've got Moomba, Birdman Rally. There's all sorts of things that activate the river. And one thing which I think is important to recognise in this plan is that this activation has been good. Some of it has been commercial, some of it has been community, but all the activation does is bring people onto the river, and it's mainly in the lower reaches of the river obviously. And I'd like to see this plan recognise that contribution, also encourage and plan for the future activation of the river, because there's no point having a beautiful river if people aren't out there and enjoying it.
It's a balance, isn't it, Mayor, of leaving and of activity?
I'm a very keen liloer. And in Warburton, in the weekends, in summer, everyone's just down the river all day, every day on their lilos, and then dragging them back upstream and back down again. And that's what we do in Warburton. Absolutely,
I think that counts as activation.
What's that?
That counts as activation, I think.
That activation is so important. Look, my personal vision is that there is a walking track along the entire length of the Yarra. I mean, most of the Yarra's banks are still in private hands. What if there was a path all the way to the Great Forest National Park, which hasn't happened yet, but we're hoping.
It'd be one of the great world walks, couldn't it?
Yes.
It would.
I mean, people always tell me, oh, I've gone on a pilgrimage, I went off to Europe, and I go, but that path's, only 1,000 or 2 years old. We've got one of the oldest paths in the world here, and we could be walking it. Imagine if every child walked from the sea to the source, found out what their body...
A rite of Melburnian passage.
A rite of passage.
A
What
nice
if
drink
they
at the
could
end.
know that their body is 70% Yarra? Because we're 70% water and we mainly drink the Yarra. I'm more river, I'm more Yarra than anything. I'm more Birrarung than I am a human. Like it's a complex intertwining that we have, and how can we celebrate that by activating the entire length of the Yarra, and boating. I've got some young friends who canoe and fish in the river up there. Imagine if there were places that people could do that. They could boat the entire length of the Yarra and they could see it. They would see the rubbish flowing into the river. They would pick it up.
I think that raises that consciousness of the things that are having a detracting effect, for sure.
I agree with Clem as well. And Clem, you've been, trying to get that sort of activation up in many different ways over many years. I think if you jumped on a bike and left South Bank and cycled upstream, I wonder how many cafes or destinations that you would actually encounter. So I can think of Canteen at Como.
Collingwood Children's Farm.
Yeah, so you probably got to go
Herring Island
15k up the river from South Bank, and over that 15k you'd probably find one destination where you could get a cup of coffee. That's
inhuman.
Exactly. So there are lots of opportunities for that activation, I think, and I do think the plan's got to deal with that, yeah.
Thank you. Look, I'm delighted this seminar is going on, and I congratulate Melbourne Water for putting it on. My name's Ian Penrose. I was the riverkeeper for 9 years, and I'm delighted to have had that role. I love what Maya has talked about here about people getting close to the river as a prerequisite for caring about it, and we don't have that opportunity. But I am worried, and I'll share my worry, and it's what Chris Chesterfield said here, is that Melbourne's forecast to have even more people coming in. We may be double this size in the next 40 years. And my question, therefore, is really to Jeff. One of the, when I listen to people talking about their attachment to the river, rarely, and usually not, is it to do with the built structures. It is normally to do with closeness to nature, the closeness to the feeling of being there and catching and touching with that history of the river, touching with the fauna there and the greenery, and being able to ride your bike or push your pram. But the concern is the built structures, and they're the ones that often take away that attachment to the river. What vision, Jeff, would you have, or maybe you, Chris, to how you're going to build Melbourne to cope with twice as many people and yet not take away the desire to keep the Yarra protected for more built infrastructure?
Chief, you want to go with that?
The river in many ways is the lungs of the city in a similar way to that sort of notion of the green wedge which facilitates the lungs of the city. We need that buffer where we can actually connect to our rivers. And my approach to sort of the built environment is it should be a holistic approach. And I think too often we get caught up in the artefact of building, but not understanding that it's about connecting to people. So my strategy and my approach has always been people-centred. And so if we're doing something which takes away our enjoyment of the places which are significant to us, then we're doing it the wrong way about. And so consequently, I think we need to be more considered in our responses and using design as a creative mechanism to solve challenging issues, which means that invariably there are competing forces. And so we have to do our level best to come up with the best solutions for the given situation. And so we know parts of the river have been dramatically disturbed. And so where there are opportunities to revitalise places which have been damaged, then we should be doing that. And the built form shouldn't be impacting in such a way that it becomes detrimental to our use of the river and also to maintain its longevity. Because what we don't want is we don't want a river which has been so altered or polluted or damaged along the way that it ceases to function the way we want it to into the future. Because we want to leave a legacy for our children. So consequently, we do have that major responsibility to engage with the river in ways which aren't going to harm it.
And Chris, these balances of interest, and this is what planning's about. This is what makes it hard.
Look, absolutely, and I guess the river has different character in different places, and through this inner city reach, and Docklands is a good example, I guess, of a recent transformation of a port and industrial area that has a very high density built environment that is right on the edges of the river, but it creates its own character. It's transformed what was already a very unnatural environment.
And it is very much a constructed landscape.
It's a constructed landscape.
Because as we know, and we saw through the imagery how dramatically changed that whole area has sort of dealt with. And so consequently, this is a different dynamic that we're responding to.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, there is that tendency of people wanting to gravitate to the water's edge. Mm. So we have to find a balance where we're not starting to do things in such a way that it starts to affect our ability to actually connect with it. Because if we're building hard up to the water's edge, how do we as people enjoy that edge condition and understand that connection to the landscape if it's being prevented that we can actually get reasonable access onto it and sight lines and view lines and so forth to it?
And yet the positive of that, I mean, for so many years Melbourne pretended it wasn't there rather than as a tip. And turned our back on it. Now
it started with this building in many respects.
We are facing it now.
Yeah.
The most exciting thing around here used to be the Allens
That's
side.
right.
Not so much anymore in the middle here.
Thank you. I'm reminded of a few things here in this discussion. I had the good fortune to be born and raised in the Heidelberg district, and as a child in the 40s and 50s, I had a lot to do with the Yarra River. My parents loved to go to the Yarra at Warringal Park in Heidelberg on very hot days and cool off in the cool waters of the Yarra. And I learned to swim there when I was 5 or 6 or 7 years of age, and I remember the feel of the cool water and the reassurance from my parents that it was safe to drink and you could fearlessly drink the water without having a bad taste in your mouth. It was a wonderful place, and it was a popular occupation for a lot of the community around Heidelberg. In the really hot weather, hundreds of cars would converge on Warringal Park, and people would just walk down, find picnic spots, and if it was really hot, they just couldn't wait for their lunch to be digested so that they could hurl themselves into the water again. And from this beginning, and from my father's interest in fishing and the beautiful environment that existed close to the banks of the river, I developed a love of that river, which I've still got today. And I see the river as an arterial system connecting the mountain ranges to the north with the sea to the south. And that arterial system, in my idealising mind's eye, is an area where pre-European vegetation is nurtured and recreated all along the waterways, so that you've got this interconnected network of pre-European vegetation providing for biodiversity, for beauty, keeping the health of the river at its best, and giving people this remarkable experience that the Indigenous people of our region had for thousands of years. There are still places on the Yarra where we have the privilege of living in Talangi, where the giant trees are that Maya referred to before. And I actually did some historical research and found that what she said was actually true. Back in the 90s, I found a letter about the biggest tree ever measured on the face of the earth. Well, I concluded that after reading it, and I did some more research and found that a tree in the Watts River catchment, which flows into the Yarra, was measured at 433 feet from the roots to a break in the trunk. And the crown of the tree was out in front of that break. It was 3 feet thick at the break, 18 feet thick above the buttresses. And it was found by a surveyor by the name of William Ferguson in 1872. And on researching it further, I found that it was actually the tallest tree ever measured on the planet, exceeding the Californian redwoods by about 30 metres.
Yeah, mate, validation.
So, we have the privilege, as I say, of living in 80-metre high forest on the Myers Creek out of Healesville. And we've also got a place in Hawthorne, and it relates to urban design and the relationship to the river. An incident that happened quite recently, a developer came along, bought a house, and put up a plan to demolish this house and put 14 units 4 stories high on a fairly high spot in close proximity to the river. So we were some of a local community that staunchly opposed this in VCAT, but the right of the developer to make his profits was seen as more important than people's feelings. So it went ahead.
Let me stop you there, because I want to, Mayor, get your thought on that idea of the arterial, this arterial connection that this river provides.
Well, it's absolutely the case. You know, there, and you know, your vision there of returning the entire length of the river to indigenous vegetation and bringing that awareness of the incredible beauty. I don't know if any of you have sort of gone to national parks in other areas of Victoria, say Wilson's Prom or Croajingalong, and you've seen the tea tree and that estuarine area. I think they're some of the most beautiful places in the world. And you know, we've got, you know, elms and parklands and things, but, you know, thinking this long-term vision, let's start dreaming that level of beauty and care and connection right now. And as you say, to protect a really wide buffer, as wide as we possibly can ask for, you know, so that we don't have, you know, huge towers of units looking over the river. It can't come soon enough.
I think we've got time for one more. Who wants to be lucky last? Oh, here we go.
Must be my lucky day. I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that what we call Port Phillip Bay is actually the fat bit of the river.
Yeah.
And I really think in terms of visioning, it would do well to embrace the bay as part of this vision, to bring on board all of the other Melburnians who might not live near the Yarra, but they do know Port Phillip Bay and they visit it regularly. So to really push the message that this is one waterway and it's a beautiful asset. We've got a world-class asset to look after, and particularly take advantage of the lower reaches where the estuaries, the bay, the salt water meets the fresh water, which is a rich ecotone and which is under the gravest of dangers for future development. If you have a look at the northern bank past Southern Cross Station or Spencer Street, heading down towards the Balti Bridge, there's some disused industrial space there that is ripe for the pickings for massive multi-units. And the existing buildings that are there totally are over the bank of the river. They totally overshadow it. There's no greenery. The people there that you see from the river are just there having a fag. On the south bank side, there's trees and there's a bit of space and there's some sunshine. That's what we need to try and invent on the north side too.
It's interesting, Chris, that idea of getting a holistic view of the entire complex system of waters here.
You know, just, I guess, reflecting a bit on what Uncle Dave was saying about that Yarra history, and you know, the Aboriginal people lived here when the Yarra River actually flowed across the bay out through the heads, and the Tamar River in Tasmania was actually a tributary of the Yarra River, believe it or not. And you know, so that you go back at 16,000 years or so, we still had a land bridge to Tasmania. So
it's a short space, isn't it?
If you go back far enough in time, you do see these remarkable connections, and they're the stories that we do need to get out there. There are there's the Western science version of that story, and there's the sort of the spiritual and the legend and the mythical sides of those stories, which which have a correlation, which are really fascinating and pretty rare, I'd say, on this planet as well. So I'd endorse that. And there are so few remnants, I guess, of the original landscape on the Lower Yarra. I can think of one little bit at the which is the Stony Creek backwash. If anyone's ever visited that,
the mangroves, the
southern mangroves, because that's another unique feature of our environment, that we have the southern and westernmost distribution of mangroves in Australia, and they're the last remnants of mangroves around the bay and on the Lower Yarra.
Well, I think we've heard some extraordinary tales and remarkable things about this river that's clearly dear in all your hearts. You have your postcards, you know what to do. write some words of inspiration or some questions. Whatever takes your fancy on those, people will be placed to take them in as you leave. The website as well is, there's an extraordinary interactive element of that site where you can put your own stories along the course of the river, which is a fantastic thing. If you could thank Chris Chesterfield, Mayor Ward and Jefa Greenaway.